So, tonight's story is a classic scary story. It is a great story, and it is very unsettling. It has a great plot twist at the end, but this story is sort of so unbelievable that I think a lot of people are going to have a hard time actually believing it. But I will tell you that when this happened, it happened in Hong Kong, and it got picked up by many major news outlets and was covered extensively. So, that suggests there is some real credibility to this story. But ultimately, it is up to you to decide what you actually believe. One evening in December of 1989, a young waiter named Zoe was bussing a table at the restaurant he worked at in Hong Kong when he heard the restaurant's phone ring. And the sound really stressed Zoe out because the restaurant was really busy that night, and it was only Zoe and one other waiter working along with the manager who was in the back. And so Zoe was bussing this table, trying his best to keep up with the endless flow of hungry customers who had packed into the small dining room. The restaurant was a popular local spot, known for serving traditional comfort food to the hardworking people of the neighborhood. On any given night, the air inside was thick with the steam from large boiling pots of broth, the rich aroma of roasted meats, and the constant, overwhelming clatter of plastic dishes and wooden chopsticks. It was a chaotic environment, but Zoe was used to it. He was a young man in his early 20s, and he had been working at this restaurant for several months. He had grown up in a working-class family in the quieter residential district of the New Territories, and he had to commute a long way on the public buses every single day just to get to this job. He was a diligent worker, always showing up on time and doing his best to keep the customers happy, even though the pay was incredibly low and the hours were exhausting. He had dreams of eventually saving enough money to start his own small business, or perhaps go back to school to study engineering, but for now, his daily life was entirely defined by the relentless, grinding pace of the restaurant floor. The work was physically punishing, and by the end of every single shift, his back would be aching, his feet would be covered in painful blisters, and the heavy smell of cooking grease would be thoroughly baked into his hair and clothes. He worked 6 days a week, and on most nights, he was simply too tired to do anything other than crawl into bed the moment he got home. On this particular evening, the winter cold had settled deeply over Hong Kong, and it seemed like everyone in the neighborhood wanted to warm up with a hot meal. The dining room was completely full, and Zhou was running back and forth, carrying heavy trays of hot food, refilling teacups, and wiping down greasy tables. His feet were aching, and his forehead was covered in sweat. He began looking around for the other waiter to see if maybe she heard the phone and could go take the call, but he saw her, and she was busy actually taking another table's order. She was nodding her head and writing frantically on her notepad as a family of 6 ordered their dinner. The manager was somewhere in the back office, likely going over the daily accounts or ordering supplies, and he would not normally take phone calls anyway. And so Zhou sighed, stopped bussing the table, put down his wet cleaning cloth, and walked over to where the phone was mounted on the wall near the counter. This phone was an old, cream-colored plastic unit that had become sticky from years of exposure to kitchen grease. Its ring was incredibly loud and sharp, a high-pitched bell that vibrated through the small hallway. He picked up the receiver, and right away he could barely hear the person who was talking on the other end. It was the voice of what sounded like a very frail, older woman, and she was practically whispering into the phone. The line was filled with static, and the background noise in the restaurant made it almost impossible to hear. Zhou had to block his other ear with his hand and lean in close to the wall, straining to catch every word. He kept asking the person to speak up, explaining that the restaurant was extremely loud, but the voice remained low, quiet, and strangely flat. There was no emotion, no rise and fall in the pitch, and no warmth in it whatsoever. It sounded almost mechanical, as if she was reading from a script with very little breath left in her lungs. Finally, Zhou was able to make out what this woman was calling for. She was calling because she wanted to place an order for delivery. Now, this was in the late 1980s, long before the era of modern food delivery applications or internet ordering. In Hong Kong at that time, if a customer called a restaurant to request a delivery, it meant that the restaurant staff had to handle everything themselves. One of the waiters would have to write down the order, wait for the kitchen to prepare the food, and then literally walk or run through the city streets to deliver the food directly to the customer's door. It was a tedious and exhausting task, especially when the restaurant was already short-handed. As soon as Zhou realized that this was a delivery call, his heart sank. He thought to himself that his luck could not get any worse. He was already overwhelmed with the tables in the dining room, his coworker was busy, and now he was going to have to leave the restaurant to deliver a meal. He knew that leaving the floor would place an even bigger burden on the other waitress, but he also knew he could not say no to a customer. The manager was very strict about customer service and would be furious if he turned down a sale. Zhou took a deep breath, grabbed a notepad and a pen from the counter, and asked the woman to repeat what she wanted so he could write it down. The woman spoke slowly, her voice barely louder than a whisper, forcing Zhou to concentrate entirely on her words. She ordered stir-fried rice noodles with an extra egg, an order of beef chow fun, and 2 servings of fried rice. Zoe wrote each item down carefully on his pad. He then asked for her address. She gave him the name of a nearby residential building and a specific apartment number on one of the upper floors. Zhou recognized the building. It was an older concrete high-rise located just a few blocks away, nestled in a slightly older and less modernized part of the district. He told her that the kitchen would prepare the food right away and that he would deliver it in about 30 minutes. The woman did not say thank you or offer any polite parting words. She simply hung up, leaving Zhou with the sound of a dead dial tone in his ear. Zhou stared at the receiver for a brief second, feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. The flat, lifeless quality of her voice had felt incredibly unsettling, almost as if he had been speaking to someone who was barely alive. But he did not have time to dwell on it. The restaurant was still buzzing with hungry customers, and he had to get back to work. He tore the order sheet off his notepad, walked into the kitchen, and handed it to the head chef, asking him to make it as quickly as possible. About 15 minutes later, the metal bell in the kitchen dinged, signaling that the takeout order was ready. Zhou walked over to the counter and saw a large plastic bag filled with containers of hot, steaming food. The rich, savory smell of the noodles and beef drifted up from the bag. Zhou grabbed the bag, pulled the printed receipt containing the address off the machine, and stapled it to the plastic. He found the other waitress and told her that he had to run a quick delivery to a nearby building. He asked her to keep an eye on his tables for just a little while, promising that he would be back as fast as he could. She nodded, understanding the situation, and Zhou rushed out the front door of the restaurant. The moment he stepped outside, the cold winter air hit his face, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the kitchen. He looked down at the receipt to confirm the address, and then he started jogging down the busy streets. The neon signs of Hong Kong, displaying Chinese characters in bright reds, greens, and blues, were reflecting off the damp pavement, and the sidewalks were crowded with people doing their evening shopping, rushing home from work, or visiting local street food stalls. Zhou navigated through the crowds, turning down a narrow, quieter side street where the older residential buildings were located. This part of the neighborhood was much darker, with fewer streetlights and older architecture. He arrived at the apartment building, a massive tower of gray concrete that looked weathered, dirty, and dark against the night sky. He walked into the lobby, which was quiet and dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that hummed softly. He entered the elevator, which was old and had a manual iron gate that he had to slide open and shut. He pressed the button for the woman's floor, and the elevator rose slowly, creaking and shuddering as it went until it finally stopped with a dull ding. Zhou stepped out into a long, quiet hallway. The floor was made of cold tile, and the walls were painted a dull, peeling yellow. The hallway was completely empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of the building's pipes and the faint sound of televisions playing behind closed doors. Zhou walked down the corridor, looking at the numbers on the apartment doors. He finally reached the correct door. He stopped, adjusted the plastic bag in his hand, and knocked firmly on the wood. He stood there, waiting for the door to open, but nothing happened. There was no sound of movement from inside. Zhou looked at his watch, feeling the pressure of the busy restaurant back down the street. He knew he had to get back. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out, saying that he was here with the food delivery. Still, there was only silence. He checked the receipt again, comparing the apartment number to the brass digits on the door. It was a perfect match. He was definitely at the correct place. Feeling increasingly frustrated, Zhou decided to abandon his polite demeanor. He raised his fist and banged loudly on the door, shouting that he had her delivery and that he really needed to go back to work. After a few moments of loud knocking, Zhou finally heard a faint sound of movement from the other side of the door. It was a slow, shuffling sound, followed by the heavy metal clicks of locks being slowly undone. The door began to open, but it did not swing wide. Instead, it opened only a tiny fraction, creating a narrow crack about 2 inches wide. Zhou tried to look through the gap, but the interior of the apartment was pitch black. No lights were turned on inside, and the darkness was so complete that he could not see a single detail of the entryway. He stood there, holding the bag of hot food out toward the crack. Suddenly, out of the deep shadow of the opening, a small, pale hand slowly emerged. The hand was holding several folded paper bills. A voice drifted through the gap, and Zhou recognized it immediately as the same frail, whispering voice from the phone. The voice told him to take the money, leave the food on the floor in the hallway, and go. Zhou thought this was extremely bizarre behavior. He could not understand why this person would not just open the door, take the food, and say thank you like a normal customer. It felt incredibly cold and secretive. But at the same time, Zhou was too tired and hurried to care about the strange habits of his customers. He reached out, pulled the folded paper bills from the cold, pale fingers, and placed the warm plastic bag of food on the tiled floor in front of the door. He said, "Thank you," but there was no reply. He turned around and began walking back toward the elevator. Behind him, he heard the door click shut and the heavy locks slide back into place. He rode the elevator down to the lobby, ran back through the cold streets, and burst into the warm restaurant. He walked over to the cash register, opened the drawer, and slid the folded bills inside without looking at them closely. eager to get back to his waiting tables and finish his shift. Later that night, the restaurant finally closed its doors. The last of the customers had left, and Joe and the other waitress were busy with their closing duties. They were sweeping up the dropped napkins and food crumbs, wiping down the sticky tables, and preparing the dining room for the next day. They were both exhausted and looking forward to going home to rest. Suddenly, the door to the back office opened, and the manager walked out. The manager was a middle-aged man who was known for being extremely strict, frugal, and deeply concerned with the restaurant's profits. He watched the daily cash flow like a hawk, and he did not tolerate any mistakes. He did not look like his usual calm self. His face was tense, and his eyes were filled with anger. He strolled over to the two waiters, and they both stopped working, sensing that something was wrong. The manager looked at them and, without any explanation, stated that he knew one of them had been stealing money from the restaurant. Joe and the waitress stared at him in complete disbelief. Joe knew for a fact that he had never stolen a single cent in his life, and he could see from the shocked expression on his coworker's face that she was innocent as well. She was a young student who worked part-time to help pay for her studies, and she looked terrified. Joe spoke up, telling the manager that they had not taken any money. He asked how the manager could make such an accusation. The manager replied that he had just finished balancing the register for the day, and the cash total was short by a significant amount. He said he did not care who did it, but he warned them that if it ever happened again, they would both be fired on the spot. He then turned around and walked back into his office, shutting the door firmly behind him. Joe and the waitress stood there, feeling incredibly hurt and confused. They finished their chores in silence, too upset to talk, and left the restaurant for the night. Joe walked home, trying to convince himself that the manager had simply made a mistake in his math and that the issue would be resolved the next day. The next morning, Joe returned to the restaurant for his shift. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The manager remained in his office, and Joe was working with a different waiter that day. The restaurant was just as busy as the previous day, and Joe tried to keep his head down and focus on his tasks, wanting to avoid any further trouble. As the dinner rush began, the dining room once again filled with hungry patrons, and the noise level rose. In the middle of all the commotion, the phone on the wall began to ring. Joe looked at his coworker, but the other waiter was busy serving a table. Joe sighed and walked over to answer the call. He picked up the receiver and said hello. Immediately, he felt a wave of unease wash over him. The voice on the other end was the same quiet, frail whisper. It was the same old woman. Joe had to block his other ear again, straining to hear her over the noise. She was placing the exact same order as the night before. Stir-fried rice noodles with an extra egg, beef chow fun, and 2 servings of fried rice. Joe felt a mix of frustration and strange curiosity. He asked her to repeat the address, and she gave him the exact same apartment number in the concrete high-rise. Joe wrote it down, told her the food would be there in 30 minutes, and hung up. He took the order to the kitchen, wondering why this woman was ordering so much food again and why she ordered the exact same items. 15 minutes later, the kitchen bell rang. Joe walked over, grabbed the bag of hot food, attached the receipt, and left the restaurant. He ran through the cold, neon-lit streets, entered the quiet lobby of the apartment building, and rode the elevator up to her floor. He walked down the empty hallway and stopped at her door. He knocked loudly, wanting to get her attention quickly. Just like the night before, there was no initial response. He knocked again and called out. Finally, he heard the slow sound of locks turning. The door opened just a tiny crack, and the same pale, small hand emerged from the pitch-black interior, holding folded paper bills. The whispering voice told him to leave the food on the floor and go. Joe took the money, placed the plastic bag of food on the tiles, and watched the door click shut. He returned to the restaurant, placed the folded money into the register, and continued working until closing time. That night, the closing routine was interrupted once again. The manager came storming out of his back office, looking even more furious than the night before. He walked straight up to Zoe, ignoring the other waiter who was working that shift. The manager looked at Zoe and said that he knew Zoe was the thief. He said that Zoe was the only waiter who had worked both yesterday and today, and once again the register was short. Zoe was deeply offended and angry. He raised his voice, telling the manager that he had not stolen anything and that he was making a huge mistake. He demanded to know how the manager could be so sure that money was actually missing. The manager stared at Zoe, trying to see if he would confess. Then the manager explained that the situation was even worse than he had initially thought. He said the money was not just missing, but that someone was replacing the real cash with counterfeit bills. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bills that had been found in the register, showing them to Joe. When Zoe looked at the bills, he was completely stunned. This was not normal counterfeit money. It was ghost money, also known as hell bank notes. In Hong Kong, this is a very specific type of joss paper printed to resemble paper currency. It is used exclusively as a ritual offering for the deceased. People buy this paper money and burn it at funerals or during traditional festivals, believing that the smoke carries the value of the money to the afterlife so their ancestors can use it. The paper is incredibly cheap, and it is printed with bright, colorful designs that look absolutely nothing like real currency. It would be impossible for anyone to mistake ghost money for real cash during a transaction. To find this joss paper inside the cash drawer was not only a financial issue, but in Chinese culture, it was also considered a terrible omen of bad luck, a curse of death, and ruin for the business. This explained why the manager was so incredibly furious and freaked out. Zhou looked at the manager and told him that this proved his innocence. He argued that if he were trying to steal from the restaurant, he would never leave behind ghost money in the drawer because it would be noticed immediately. It would be the stupidest way to commit a crime. The manager paused, realizing that Zhou's logic was sound. No thief in their right mind would put joss paper in a cash register to cover their tracks. The manager then suggested that perhaps Zhou had accepted the fake money from a customer during the chaotic dinner rush without looking at it. Zhou shook his head, stating that he would have felt the difference in the paper instantly. But then, a thought occurred to Zhou. He remembered the strange delivery he had made over the last 2 nights. Zhou told the manager about the old woman who had called 2 nights in a row, ordering the exact same food. He described how she would only open her door a tiny crack, revealing a pitch-black apartment, and how she would slide a pale hand out with folded bills, telling him to leave the food on the floor. He said it was the only unusual thing that had happened during his shifts. The manager listened carefully, his anger fading as he considered the details. He agreed that the delivery was highly suspicious and that the timing matched the appearance of the ghost money. The manager decided that if the woman called again the next day, he would personally make the delivery. He wanted to see who this person was and determine if they were somehow passing off fake money. The following evening, the restaurant was busy once again. Zhou was working, keeping an eye on the phone. Sure enough, at around the same time as the previous nights, the phone began to ring. Zhou rushed over and picked up the receiver. The frail, whispering voice of the old woman was on the line, placing the exact same order: stir-fried rice noodles with an extra egg, beef chow fun, and 2 servings of fried rice. Zhou wrote down the details, confirmed the address, and told her the food would be delivered soon. He then went directly to the back office and told the manager that she had called. The manager nodded, put on his coat, and waited for the kitchen to prepare the food. When the takeout bag was ready, the manager grabbed it, checked the receipt, and left the restaurant. He walked through the cold streets, determined to find out the truth. He arrived at the apartment building, rode the elevator up, and walked down the hallway to the correct door. He knocked firmly and called out, announcing the delivery. Just like before, there was only silence at first. The manager knocked again, louder this time. After a few moments, he heard the slow shuffling of feet and the sound of locks turning. The door opened just a tiny crack, revealing the pitch-black interior of the apartment. A cold draft of air drifted out from the gap, making the manager shiver. Then, the small, pale hand slowly emerged, holding folded paper bills. The manager did not just take the money and leave. He reached out, took the bills, and held them up to the light of the hallway. He felt the texture of the paper and inspected the printing closely. To his surprise, the money was completely real. It was crisp, genuine Hong Kong currency with all the correct markings. There was absolutely nothing fake about it. The whispering voice from the darkness told him to leave the food on the floor and go. The manager, finding no evidence of counterfeiting, placed the bag of food on the tiles, put the real cash into his coat pocket, and walked back to the restaurant, feeling a bit relieved but still confused by the woman's strange behavior. Later that night, after closing, the manager was in his back office counting the money from the cash register. As he finished his calculations, he realized that the drawer was short once again. He checked his receipts and did his math several times, but the numbers simply did not add up. He was short by the exact cost of the delivery order he had made earlier that evening. Suddenly, he remembered the cash he had collected from the old woman. He had put it in his coat pocket and forgotten to deposit it into the cash drawer. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded bills, and was about to drop them into the register when he froze. The manager stared at his hand in absolute terror. The bills he was holding were no longer the crisp, real currency he had carefully inspected under the hallway light. They had transformed into colorful sheets of ghost money. He felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. He knew for a fact that he had checked that money and it had been real. He began to panic, unable to comprehend how real paper currency could turn into funeral joss paper inside his own pocket. The only logical explanation he could think of was that they were dealing with an incredibly sophisticated counterfeiter who used some kind of advanced chemical coating that faded after a few hours, revealing the fake paper underneath. Deciding that this was a matter for the authorities, the manager picked up the phone and called the police, reporting a highly unusual and dangerous counterfeiting operation. 2 police officers arrived at the restaurant a short time later. The manager and Zhou explained the entire situation, showing them the ghost money and describing the 3 strange deliveries to the concrete high-rise. The officers were highly skeptical, finding the story of transforming money hard to believe, but since counterfeiting was a serious crime, they agreed to accompany the manager and Zhou to the apartment complex to investigate. They got into their patrol car and drove through the dark, quiet streets. Arriving at the building in a matter of minutes, they entered the lobby and rode the elevator up to the specified floor. The atmosphere in the elevator was silent and tense. When the doors opened, they stepped out into the quiet hallway. Almost immediately, the officers noticed a strange, unpleasant odor in the air. As they walked closer to the specific apartment door, the smell grew rapidly stronger, turning into a thick, sweet, and sickening stench of rot and decay. The officers recognized that smell instantly. It was the unmistakable odor of decomposing flesh. They immediately drew their weapons, their faces tightening with professional concern. They instructed Zoe and the manager to stand back near the elevator. One of the officers knocked heavily on the wooden door, identifying themselves as police and demanding that whoever was inside open the door immediately. There was no answer. The hallway was dead silent except for the low hum of the building's ventilation. The officers looked at each other, knowing that they had to enter. One of the officers took a step back, raised his leg, and kicked the door with all his might. The lock shattered, and the door swung open, hitting the inside wall with a loud bang. The moment the door opened, a wave of hot, foul air rushed out of the apartment, causing the men to gag and cover their faces. The officers turned on their flashlights and stepped into the dark, cold apartment. The electricity had been cut off, so they had to navigate by the beams of their lights. As they moved into the living room, they shunned their lights around and were met with a horrifying sight. Sitting and lying around the living room were 4 human bodies. They were in an advanced state of decomposition. The skin was dark, shriveled, and bloated, and the physical state of the bodies was extremely shocking. But what shocked the officers even more was what was scattered around the room. On the tables and the floor were several plastic takeout containers and paper bags from the very restaurant where Joe worked. Some of the containers were open, showing half-eaten portions of food. The police immediately secured the scene and called for forensic investigators and the medical examiner. An investigation was launched to determine how these 4 people had died. Investigators discovered a severe carbon monoxide leak coming from a malfunctioning gas water heater in the bathroom. The heater had been malfunctioning, slowly venting carbon monoxide into the unventilated apartment. Carbon monoxide is a silent, odorless, colorless gas that is highly toxic. When people inhale it, it deprives their brain and organs of oxygen, leading to rapid unconsciousness and death. The investigators concluded that the family had passed away quietly in their sleep or while relaxing in the living room, completely unaware of the deadly gas filling the air. Based on the advanced state of decomposition of the bodies and the weather conditions, the medical examiner estimated that the carbon monoxide leak had occurred at least a week, possibly even 10 days, before the police kicked the door down. This meant that all 4 people inside the apartment had been dead for over a week. But this scientific conclusion created a whole bunch of questions for the police and certainly for Zoe and his manager, because it was like, wait a minute, we have been delivering food to this apartment to somebody. Somebody keeps opening the door and handing us this money that is apparently counterfeit money, ghost money. Someone has been doing that. And clearly there are bags of takeout food that were literally the bags that they brought from the restaurant. It turned out it was the same stuff, like, who has been in here? It did not make any sense. There must be somebody else that was maybe in here with the dead bodies or something. However, there was one other truly confounding discovery that had been made already that was made during the autopsies of these 4 people that really added a pretty awful twist to the story that to this day, like, nobody can understand. Nobody has a good explanation for this. And really, this is the reason this story went so viral at the time and was covered by so many news outlets. So, in addition to the autopsies discovering that these people died from a carbon monoxide leak, during the autopsies, they cut open the stomachs of each of these 4 people. And they found the takeout food, the stir-fried egg noodles, the beef chow fun, the fried rice that was brought over by Joe and his manager from their restaurant. That was the food inside of their stomachs. And the food was determined to be about maybe 1 or 2 days old. So literally the food they brought over these dead people consumed, even though, according to their own autopsies, they were dead by the time the food arrived. And Joe and his manager would confirm they brought the food over like a day ago. These people would have been dead by then. So how did the food get into their stomachs? Now, to a lot of people, the only explanation here was that whoever ordered the food, whoever called that frail-sounding older woman who then paid with ghost money, was literally a ghost. The 4 dead people's spirits must have been in some kind of limbo, stuck inside the apartment where they had died, feeling bored and hungry. This incident, which now is just known as the ghost takeaway incident because takeaway is another word for delivery food, has been written about extensively in major publications all over Hong Kong, and it has been picked up in other parts of the world. And so there are plenty of people that say, this really happened. This is true. We don't know what to make of it, but it's true. This happened. But other people say this is just an amazing urban legend. It is up to you what you think is really true. The emotional impact of this event on Zoe and his manager was profound. For weeks after the discovery, Zoe could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that pale, cold hand reaching out from the darkness of the apartment door. He kept hearing that frail, whispering voice in his head telling him to leave the food on the floor. The realization that he had been interacting with the spirits of the dead, that he had accepted funeral money from a corpse, was too much for him to bear. He eventually decided to quit his job at the restaurant, unable to stand the sound of the phone ringing. He moved away from the neighborhood, trying to start a new life and leave the memory of that terrible night behind him. The manager also struggled to cope with what had happened. He could not explain how the real cash he had held in his hand had transformed into ghost money in his pocket. It shattered his understanding of reality. He eventually sold the restaurant and retired, wanting to distance himself from the mystery. The apartment building itself became a subject of local dread. Neighbors reported hearing strange whispering sounds coming from the hallway near the door of the empty apartment, and many claimed to see a pale hand briefly appearing in the shadows of the corridor. The apartment remained vacant for years, a silent monument to an impossible tragedy. The legal authorities were left in a difficult position. They had a clear cause of death for the 4 family members, which was accidental carbon monoxide poisoning, but they had absolutely no way to explain the physical evidence of the food deliveries. The official police report focused on the accidental deaths, leaving the details of the phone calls, the ghost money, and the autopsies out of the public files as much as possible to avoid causing panic. But the doctors and officers who had witnessed the evidence firsthand knew that something beyond human understanding had occurred in that concrete high-rise. As the years passed, the story of the ghost takeaway became a staple of Hong Kong folklore, a tale told to children on cold winter nights and whispered among restaurant workers. It served as a reminder of the thin line that exists between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and how easily that line can sometimes be crossed. Whether it was a biological miracle, an elaborate and cruel hoax, or a genuine supernatural event, the mystery remains unsolved, a chilling puzzle that continues to haunt those who know the truth. To deep dive into the historical backdrop of this case, Hong Kong during the late 1980s was undergoing massive social and economic transitions. The city was a fast-paced financial hub, yet old traditions and beliefs coexisted perfectly with modern tall skyscrapers. The neighborhood of Sham Shui Po, where many believe this incident took place, was densely populated with a mix of industrial buildings and residential tenements. People lived in incredibly close quarters, meaning that neighbors often knew the daily schedules of those around them. The sudden silence from the apartment where the family died should have been noticed sooner, but because many residents worked multiple jobs with long, irregular hours, the absence of the family went unnoticed for several days. This quiet indifference of the big city made it possible for the tragedy to remain hidden until the supernatural occurrences forced it into the open. The technical investigation into the carbon monoxide leak also revealed some disturbing details. The water heater was located in a small, unventilated bathroom with a door that remained shut. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in the bloodstream much faster than oxygen does, essentially suffocating the victim from the inside out while they are still breathing. The process is completely painless, often causing the victim to feel tired and simply fall asleep. It is highly likely that the family members passed away without ever realizing they were in danger. They were sitting in their living room, watching television or talking, and they simply drifted off into death. This sudden, peaceful transition may explain why their spirits remained so peaceful and active inside the apartment, completely unaware that their physical bodies had ceased to function. In traditional Chinese folklore, the spirits of those who die suddenly or tragically are often believed to remain trapped in the physical location of their death, especially if they do not realize they have passed away. These spirits are known as hungry ghosts, and they are believed to retain their physical desires, such as hunger and the need for shelter. During the Hungry Ghost Festival, which takes place during the 7th month of the lunar calendar, it is common for people to leave plates of food and burn joss paper on the streets to appease these wandering spirits. But the fact that this incident occurred in December, outside of the traditional festival period, suggests that the family was trapped in a highly localized spiritual loop. They were repeating their daily routines, which included ordering their favorite meals from the local restaurant down the street. The joss paper itself, which played such a central role in the mystery, is a fascinating aspect of Cantonese culture. Known locally as yin xian, it is sold in small specialty shops throughout the city. The currency is often printed with incredibly high denominations, such as millions or billions of dollars, and is intended for use in the afterlife. The belief is that the spirit world has its own banking system, and burning this paper money allows the spirits to pay their debts and live comfortably. For the manager of the restaurant, finding this paper in his cash register was not only a financial loss, but a source of deep psychological terror. In Chinese business culture, receiving ghost money is considered a direct curse on the establishment, signifying that the business will suffer ruin or that death will soon visit the owner. This is why he was so quick to accuse Zhou of theft, as his mind could not accept any other logical explanation. The police officers who first entered the apartment were also deeply affected by what they saw. They were experienced beat officers who had seen many difficult cases, but the combination of the advanced decomposition and the fresh takeout containers was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The scene was completely quiet, yet it felt heavy with an unseen presence. One of the officers later recounted to colleagues that the air inside the apartment felt static, as if time had stopped moving altogether. The forensic team spent hours cataloging the scene, taking photos, and collecting the food containers for analysis. They checked the containers for fingerprints, but they only found prints matching the deceased family members. There was absolutely no trace of any third party who could have entered the home to place the food inside. The medical examiner who performed the autopsies was a highly respected professional with decades of experience in forensic pathology. He was used to dealing with difficult cases, but the stomach contents of the 4 family members left him completely baffled. The physiological process of digestion is entirely dependent on the survival of tissues and cells, which requires oxygen and blood flow. Once the heart stops beating, all metabolic processes halt. Any food inside the stomach at the time of death will remain there, slowly decomposing along with the rest of the body. But the food found in the stomachs of these 4 people was partially digested, indicating that their digestive systems had been active shortly before the bodies were discovered. There was no scientific explanation for how a body that had been dead for a week could suddenly restart its digestive functions to process a meal. It was a complete biological impossibility. The news of the autopsy findings spread quickly through the medical and law enforcement communities, eventually reaching the local newspapers. The journalists who broke the story were met with a mix of fascination and skepticism. Some accused the newspapers of sensationalism, arguing that the story was a complete fabrication designed to sell copies. But the journalists maintained that their sources within the police department and the medical examiner's office were reliable and that the physical evidence was real. The case became a major topic of debate among academics, religious leaders, and the general public, with everyone offering their own explanations for the impossible timeline. Some researchers of the paranormal have suggested that the incident was a rare case of a portal or a tear in the fabric of time. They argue that the restaurant and the apartment became temporarily linked in a temporal anomaly, allowing the physical food to cross over from the present into the past, where the family was still alive. According to this theory, the money handed over by the family was real currency in their time, but as it crossed the temporal boundary into the future, it degraded into joss paper, reflecting its true nature in the present. While this sounds like science fiction, it is one of the very few non-spiritual theories that attempts to address both the physical delivery of the food and the autopsy findings. Whatever the true explanation may be, the story of the ghost takeaway remains one of the most compelling and bone-chilling mysteries of modern times. It challenges our understanding of life, death, and the physical laws that govern our world. It forces us to confront the possibility that there are things in this universe that cannot be explained by science alone, and that the boundary between our world and the next is far more fragile than we care to admit. The memories of that cold December in 1989 continue to linger in the dark corners of Hong Kong, a quiet reminder of the day the dead ordered dinner. The restaurant itself has since changed ownership multiple times, and the building where the tragedy occurred has undergone renovations, but the story persists. It has been adapted into television segments, discussed on internet forums, and shared by successive generations of city residents. For those who walk the streets of Sham Shui Po late at night, past the older concrete buildings with their flickering lights, the story of Zhou, the manager, and the 4 quiet customers is a vivid part of the local landscape. It is a tale that reminds everyone to look a little closer at the money in their pockets and to pay attention to the quiet whispers in the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.